my Instagram grew to 100,000 in 8 months. I'm not special. I literally just did something and then kept doing it. But the growth does happen from just being not afraid to put yourself out there. I'm dyslexic, so growing up, I was creating visual notes. The house was covered in posters. The things that make you feel different in school actually become, your superpower when you're in the workplace. I condense complex ideas into simple and easy to recall visuals so that they are highly shareable online and they kind of get to the heart of the message that you're trying to share in as little words as possible. Creativity is not reserved for artists or designers. Everybody has that capacity within them to be creative.
I think one of the things that I've really learned recently is actually simplicity is the hardest thing. I think we sometimes think, simple is easy or simple is simple. And it's like actually often making something simple, making a complex thought or idea simple is the hardest thing.
And there are two different ways that you can approach making a visual. The best artists or the best creatives aren't sat at their desks all the time. They're out just with their friends or on a walk with the dog. You're out there observing the world around you rather than closed off. You've got to focus on the bit that actually matters, and getting that message out is more important than how we do it.
Welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to Starting the Conversation. I'm your host, Alice Benham, and this week I'm joined by the brilliant Hannah from Quoted Visually. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I feel very honoured, and I have to say I have known your work for so long, and it's only been in the last kind of 6 months or so that I've really understood that you are the human behind your work. So it feels very kind of full circle. And I don't know, do you hear that from people a lot, where they're like, they really know what you do, and then they're like, there's a real human here, there's a person behind all of this?
Yeah, because quite recently I've been to some events and people know my work without knowing me, and that just blows my mind.
Yeah.
But I've been following you for years. Before I even started Creative Visually, it was maybe 3-4 years ago. I had you on my personal account. So for me, it's a full circle moment in the same way.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
That was definitely it for me when you came to the small business party. I remember you'd messaged beforehand about getting involved in some of the gifts, and I clicked on your account. I was like, oh my God, that's that account. That's that account that I really love. And then when I met you at the party, I really think people at business events need to walk around with like their Instagram handle, like, I don't know, tattooed on their forehead or something, because it is that, isn't it? Like you often know that before you actually recognise the person. But a bit of context for people as to why some people might know your work, perhaps before they know you. How would you describe what your business is? I mean, everyone I know that runs a business struggles to describe it. But when I was thinking about what you do, I was like, gosh, that's another probably layer of, maybe there's not an exact box you can always tick.
Normally I show my work to people, so I might bring a print to an event.
Yes.
But generally what I do is I condense complex ideas into simple and easy to recall visuals so that they are highly shareable online and they kind of get to the heart of the message that you're trying to share in as little words as possible. And no decoration, it's just minimal illustrations.
That is a great summary of it. I summed it up probably worse than that to someone the other day. I was talking about what you do and you coming on the podcast. I was like, imagine like a meme account, but like useful. It's like, those accounts you follow where like, every post just gives you something different, but like the things that Hannah gives you are like actually useful. Like it's inspiring and it's interesting and it's thought-provoking, and you've summed it up brilliantly, because that is exactly what you do. You create the kind of work where when you look at it, you think, oh my gosh, she's an absolute genius. Not just because it's so good, but also because it's so simple. I think one of the things that I've really learned recently is actually simplicity is the hardest thing. I think we sometimes think, simple is easy or simple is simple. And it's like actually often making something simple, making a complex thought or idea simple is the hardest thing. It's
reductive. So normally you think that you want to add, and especially when I'm working with a client, their changes are additive. But for me, I'm always thinking of what is the shortest way to say the same thing, because if you add too many words or you just add too much decoration to the overall image, that initial hit is completely lost. And so it's a game of just working and playing with what works and what doesn't work.
It's so interesting, and I think it's one of those things, and I wonder if you hear this from people a lot, where people maybe see your work or what you do or something similar and just go, that's amazing, I could never do that. Is that something you hear from people a lot, where they're like, I'd love to be able to do that, but obviously I can't?
They kind of tell me that I have a talent, and I brush it off and say, no, everybody can do this. If you practice hard enough, you'll get to the same place. And that's my biggest message that I wanted to share, was that creativity is not reserved for artists or designers. Everybody has that capacity within them to be creative.
I love that. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have you join me for this episode, is because as I was thinking more about the work that you do, I actually started to realise that for all of us as business owners, being creative and having the skill of turning a concept or an idea into a visual is actually really fundamental to our work. As I started to think about it, I was like, gosh, every time that that I do a talk or a presentation, you know, there's slides, and those slides rely on visual kind of cues that sum up something that perhaps is a concept or an idea. And then I was thinking about social media and how so many people's content is graphics based. And actually, again, with a graphic, what we're trying to do is sum something up through a visual. And I'm sure there's so many other examples that we could give, but being creative and the skill that you have learned, I think is so key to business. Is that something, like, I guess it's meta for you because you also run your own business. Do you kind of see that for people, like even as you're kind of coming across other business owners, you notice like, oh, you're doing that thing, you're turning the ideas into visuals, but maybe people don't see it that way?
They're probably already organising their thoughts in some way, just not necessarily formalising them.
Yes.
And there are two different ways that you can approach making a visual. So it can be very much process-led. So you're making it to quite literally organise your thoughts. And then you're making it to, you know, present your thoughts or show to somebody else. And that's kind of the two parts of the process is, you know, coming up with the idea and then obviously presenting it. And most business owners will probably already be organising their thoughts, and kind of just gives them permission to put that out into the wider space because they are valuable.
And in your opinion, why is taking something from words to visuals so impactful? If we already have the clarity on what we're trying to say, you know, let's maybe look through the lens here of doing a presentation and we've got a slide that's got a big sentence on it. Why turn that sentence into a visual? Why is that something you think is important for us to think about doing?
It's a good question. So, I mean, the other kind of thing to mention is, I suppose we say visuals, but they are text and image, the illustrations that I create. But the reason that we do that is so that we make them much more actionable and you can remember them better having seen them as a visual. I started this project when I actually just wanted to remember what I was reading from these non-fiction books. So it was purely a hobby.
Oh, wow. What kind of non-fiction books? Like personal development or?
Yeah, there was Essentialism by Greg McKeown.
Yeah.
And he was actually one of my first followers, which pinched me.
Oh my gosh, the pressure.
Along with my boyfriend and my mum, that was like, Greg.
I love it.
Yeah, so these illustrations have become my toolkit, and I've seen firsthand how I remember all the illustrations that I create, and then I can then act, and you kind of, it's like pattern recognition. So you might be approaching a challenge, and then you just have this retrieval system where you think, oh, I've got a visual on this, I can tackle this problem. And so you just go into any kind of situation with confidence, knowing that you can handle it, given all of the pre-work that you've done.
It makes total sense. And when I think back to being a child and in school, it was so often that combination of kind of, something visual with text really helps something to land. And it is interesting, isn't it, as we transition to kind of adulthood and think, okay, now everything needs to be a bit more serious and text-based, that actually there probably is still that part of us, isn't there, that really benefits from something being visual.
Yeah, it makes it fun and novel, and that we can't underestimate the power of that.
And I guess as well, it's partly about learning styles too. Maybe some people can hear a sentence or read a sentence and cool, they've taken it in. I know that for me, as soon as someone gives an analogy or a metaphor or offers up a framework for something, it's like it just fast tracks its way into my brain. There's something about it that just makes it then so much more accessible for people.
Yeah, accessible and easier to understand. I'm dyslexic, so growing up I was, creating visual notes. The house was covered in posters. I think I had some sort of chicken coop once, and it, I can still remember it today, obviously. Not necessarily what the content was, but so I've seen that benefit, and which is why I want to, keep promoting, the use of visuals, because I think that there are so many people out there that are also dyslexic like me and would benefit from them.
Yes. Yeah, I think for so many different people, whatever their kind of circumstances, actually things being more accessible and easier to take in makes total sense. And when we think about that as business owners, I mean, obviously we want to communicate in a way that's clear. I can speak from personal experience that over the last kind of 3 or 4 years, I've really been working on getting better at public speaking. One of my big goals is to kind of have my main work be hosting workshops and doing talks. And I'm really, really excited to see my business going in that direction. And something I've really tried to work on in the last couple of years is making my talks not just like packed with information, but actually impactful. And when I think about what makes a talk impactful when I'm consuming one, when I'm listening to someone, it's when it feels simple. And ultimately when I then feel that I can actually take some action because of it. And over the last year especially, I've brought a lot more kind of analogies and visuals, and clip art is what I often call it, because it doesn't look good, but it tells a story visually. And it's so interesting to see how that has really, really changed the engagement that my talks have. I'm always interested to notice, especially when I'm doing a talk in person, what's the slide that makes people get their phone out and take a photo? And 9 times out of 10, in fact, probably 10 times out of 10, It's the slide where it's visual.
Really?
It's the slide where I haven't just put a sentence of text, but I've used some kind of dodgy clip art graphic to explain what that concept is. So I can absolutely say from personal experience, as someone who's kind of muddled their way into learning this and is very excited to learn more of the, actual expertise from you, that adopting this as business owners, I think, is so relevant and so important. And actually saying, well, I'm not creative, so I can't do that. Oh, that's Hannah's skill, that's not mine. Is probably actually quite reductive.
Yeah.
Do you believe that we are all capable of like having this creative skill? Do you get frustrated when people say like, oh, I'd love to do things like that, but I'm not an artist, I'm not creative?
They say, I can't draw, and you just, everyone says that. And the thing is, it's just like any other skill. You have to practice. It was Andy Murray that said this quote that I found in one of my little books, obscure quote, said, there's no substitute for practice. Basically, even experts have to practice. And so, expecting yourself to be able to draw without ever having drawn anything recently is kind of just, an unrealistic expectation, and we just pass it off. Whereas in actual fact, if everybody has the capacity to chip away at this day by day, and you just, improve. And even I have to practice. It's not something that, it's a muscle that you work. And so you train yourself to look for these analogies. And the more you look, the more you see. Also, you've got to capture. So if you're looking and you're observing your surroundings, but you're not capturing what you're noticing, you're not going to come up with these visual ideas. You need to capture it.
Well, that was one of my main questions for you, was that question that I'm sure you get asked all the time of where do you get your ideas? Because it's so tempting, isn't it, to look at the final product and to think, oh, that obviously came easily to Hannah. That just dropped into her hands and made itself with ease and it was good to go. And I think that can be one of those limiting beliefs that stops us flexing that creative muscle, because we just think, I don't have any ideas, or I wouldn't be able to come up with any even if I tried. What are your recommendations for people? And I guess also, what do you do personally to gather ideas? Because I wouldn't imagine step one is sitting down with Photoshop and making the visual.
Yeah, you kind of want to avoid going anywhere near a computer before you've actually got the idea formed, because you can get very distracted by these computer programs that have lovely features, and you can play around with different fonts or colors.
Yeah.
And then before you've actually, decided what you're going to say, that can be, demoralizing. You feel like you're not getting anywhere and you're just sat there for over an hour or so. And so what I do is I write down on pen and paper these ideas. It means that you can play around spatially with the notes, so they can be written or visual, and they just become this kind of like diagrammatic notes. But it's coming up with those ideas and being really sure about what you want to create before you put it into the computer. In terms of where you get them from, I say look where people aren't looking. So maybe a long form podcast or a book that somebody else, save the time, go through a book and pick out the core concept.
Yeah.
And that's what I did with the Essentialism book at the very beginning. That's how I started. I also reflect on my experiences, and that's what you generally do. You take your experience, you say, oh, I feel this, and this is what I've realized. If I feel something, someone else is definitely going to have that same feeling.
Yeah.
And it's having that courage to just vocalize it.
And if you're getting inspiration from other people, i.e. a book or a TED Talk or a podcast, how do you then make sure, or is this even something people need to consider if they're then worried about, oh my gosh, am I now like stealing this person's concept? Like obviously you're the one then making it visual, so there's absolutely, things that you're creating within that. Is that something for people to consider? Is there anything people need to be careful of if they're going, oh, I read that great thing in Alice's book? I mean, that's a real assumption, isn't it, that there's anything great in my book, but hopefully there's something in there that people might think, oh, that's interesting. Do they need to think about like, could someone just go, oh yeah, and then I'll turn that into a visual?
That's a very, very good question. So I always keep track of where I've got what I've got from. And if I'm going to share it anywhere online, the credits are there, and you're not passing off anybody else's thoughts as your own. But interestingly, because there's a community building of these visual creators, if you like, we all cross each other's tracks without realizing it. We create something that's so similar. And so what I have noticed is you all end up going and creating the similar pieces. You're all consuming similar pieces of, similar podcasts. So, it's unavoidable if creating something that's similar to somebody else's. Very obvious if you've just gone copy paste.
Yes. Okay. So I guess first step is making sure that you're looking in the places that help you to get those ideas, gathering those ideas. And even that in itself is really helpful to think about, to almost create a bit of a process. Because actually, now that I reflect on it, some of the analogies that I use the most, for years, I just used them as sentences of text. And I really knew the point I was trying to make before I then got smart. And it's not even that smart. A lot of my visuals, they feel very obvious. But, before I thought about a visual kind of metaphor or explanation for it. And I would imagine, I know as you said, sometimes you can go kind of almost visual first and then go, right, I want to use a visual that's, I don't know.
An iceberg.
An iceberg.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Okay, what could I use to describe this? I'm sure that is an approach. I wonder if for most business owners, though, they're probably starting first with what's the thing I'm trying to say. So that's like comforting to know that you don't have to start with that immediate clarity of I'm going to say this thing through an iceberg and it's going to look great. That is actually then a bit of a process to work out, okay, how can I now communicate this?
Yes, so it's extracting that little nugget of wisdom, I like to say, and then it's finding a way to visualize it, and there'll be multiple ways to do it.
Yes.
And it could be quite strategic to have, try different ways. And I always, choose my favorite way. And some people they're sharing their illustrations online, they just do all different types of, takes on one idea.
Yeah.
If you know that it's strong and it resonates with a lot of people, why not?
That's a great reminder. And you said that one nugget of an idea. Do you notice one of the mistakes people make is they're trying to like tell a million stories at once in one visual, or they're like, I want to give people these 8 tips and I need to do it in one visual. What reminder do you share with people there?
Just less is more. And so it's just going back to the same, reduced, less, so you can say a lot more if you have a fewer words on the page than if you're just cluttering up the space. It's going to be really overwhelming to look at. And so one of the things I try to do is create that sense of space on the image. If you go right to the edge of the piece, that feels claustrophobic. I realized I was doing this. I've got this course now, and I've realized I'm saying this to students is I don't like 3 lines of text. If it's becoming a bit of a paragraph, that's too much. And that's just a funny little rule that I have. You have these little quirks within your process. How can you keep it, small on the page?
And it actually takes confidence to do that, doesn't it? I look back at some of my early talks that I delivered or things that I created, and I see myself just trying to cram in so much at once. And I think obviously part of that just came from natural enthusiasm, but also part of it I think came from a bit of an insecurity of going, I need to over deliver. I need to give them all of my knowledge. I need to say everything. And actually it's learning, isn't it? There's so much more value often in just trying to say one thing. Do you sometimes notice that in your process? You'll maybe be trying to say too much and then you have to ask the question of like, how do I narrow this down? What is the one thing I'm trying to say?
You can get attached to the words. They sound great. I mean, use the words. They could be in a caption or whatever in your talk. It's refining it in as much as, little as possible. You can overdo it and then defeats the object of using a visual. So just being careful.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. As you're then thinking about how you like make it into a visual, again, I guess it's tempting to think, okay, I now need to think about what color it's going to be or whether I'm designing it on Canva or Figma or wherever else. But like, I guess actually just the next step is working out like, what is the visual going to be? Is there almost like a menu of options for people? Like, again, I think when you're new to it, you kind of think, I don't know. But then you see you'll do something and it's an iceberg, or you did one the other day that was like ice cream scoops, and I've seen ones that look like light bulbs or whatever else. And I'm like, that's so good. How do I come up with those? Like, what are the options for us when we're thinking about kind of how to make something visual?
I usually say if you go into Google and just type in the icons for the topic that you're looking at, so it might relate to the nugget of wisdom, and that will help. So Google search just to get what's the immediately coming up visual. You can also go in ChatGPT, just come up what are they suggesting. But at the minute they're quite elaborate, and I usually go back to the classic. You've got a bar chart, a pie chart, any kind of levels and liquids. If you can have containers, and then you think about, okay, what could be a different container. If you're coming and seeing my ice cream one, you might think, gosh, how did you come up with that? But it just comes to you when you're maybe I was eating ice cream and then I thought, that ice cream thing, it makes me think of that. If you're looking at someone's finished piece, you're gonna think that's not achievable, but really you're comparing the final output, and you haven't seen the process that's involved in creating something that's so refined. And that's a trap that most people can fall into.
Interesting. I mean, I feel like that happens in every area, doesn't it? We look at the finished piece and think, I can't start there, and it's like, well, neither did they. Like, you have to go through the process to get to that point. And it's great to hear that kind of list there, because actually a lot of those are like quite obvious. Do you find sometimes people try and overcomplicate it? Like, they do think like, I need to come up with the coolest, smartest analogy ever, and you're like, does a bar chart work? And they're like, yes. Okay, let's just use a bar chart.
But you'll find that when you're using a bar chart or a pie chart, can it be a donut chart? It doesn't have to be the bog standard chart. And often if it's simple, it's just they actually do better online, because I tend to find that they're just much more accessible. What it is it's not the idea is the bit that shines, and the visual is elevating it. So if the idea is strong, the visual doesn't have to be really, really strong. It can just do some of the work. Yes. It sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it doesn't matter how well put together your image is. If it really hits the nail on the head with the message, people are going to love it.
So true. Yeah. And actually I can reflect as you're sharing like some of the processes I've been on. I've done a lot of talks recently around consistent action.
Okay.
And I was trying to work out, I often talk to clients about this idea of internal versus external action. And I was putting my Hannah hat on and I was like, come on, Alice, let's try and make this visual, because I've noticed, as I said before, the visuals seem to really land for people and they make my life easier, because I'm like, just look at this. There you go. You've got the message. I don't need to say anything else. And so my first slide that I did with it was kind of these two circles, one within the other, internal in the middle, external on the outer. And I remember I delivered it and I was like, cool, I think that kind of worked. And then I was like, how can I maybe take this a step further? And I realized when I was talking about this idea of moving between internal and external, I was talking about like leaping between the two. So then it became these two islands and there's like water in the middle, and the water is where we feel scared because we're moving from internal to external action.
Yes.
And so actually that's probably a good example of where you don't often start with the best way of doing it. You just have to start with the one that's like obvious to you and then test it and take it from there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because
I feel like such a teacher's pet right now, Hannah. I'm like, I'm doing it.
No, I'm really impressed. I saw something pop up just yesterday and honestly, it's incredible.
Which one was that?
It must have been some sort of webinar that you did. It had 3 stages and it just hit what I do perfectly. It might have been with clip art, but
oh gosh, Hannah, that is potentially my most clip art-esque visual I use.
You feeling exposed?
I think that one is fish food, and then a net to describe your community, your marketing, and your sales. And actually, maybe there's something in this for people to think about as well. Like, I really thought I need to wait till I'm good at making these visuals that are like really on brand. I remember I got Figma on my iPad and I was like, okay, I'm going to make them myself. And I just like that kept getting in my way. And I was like, actually, let me just search on Canva. What am I trying to make? Fish food, net. And then I just stuck them in and they look ugly and they kind of stand out because the rest of my slides look really sleek and black and white. But like, it doesn't need to look that good for it to land. Like you said, as long as it like says the message and the message is good and it's simple, it's enough. Yeah. I was terrified though when I saw that you saw that story, because I was like, God, this is really ugly.
I think that just goes to show that it is accessible, you know.
True.
And it doesn't matter if it doesn't look a certain way. And I find that frustrating because sometimes the blurriest of images might go, I mean, going viral isn't always the goal, but they might go viral. And you think that the element of the craftsmanship isn't quite so refined, but it doesn't matter. You've got to focus on the bit that actually matters, and getting that message out is more important than how we do it.
Yeah. Alongside then some of those kind of like mathsy graphs and bar charts and pie charts that we can use, are there also any like metaphors or like frameworks that are your personal favourites? You said iceberg. Did that come to mind quickly because that's one of your faves?
It's a classic. I mean, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but the thing that I did was like these little circles that went across the image. It's a showing up daily visual. And that was one of the ones that sort of catapulted my social media. Then you develop a little bit of a visual language, and then you see other people using that same device, which is, very surreal. But I'd say that the circles with the levels, but if you're going to come up with, you've got, scales. It depends what you're trying to show. A thermometer for like the temperature, and you could just use it in a different context. You could have a catapult or a domino, so anything. Love really that. And if you just type into Google, you get all of these visual metaphors, and then you can start thinking of your own, having kind of reverse engineer what those ones do.
Yeah. Does it become a bit of a fun game, almost being like, okay, this is the thing I want to say, let me think of a metaphor that's going to help me to say that?
Yeah, like a watermelon slice or something like that. Do you know what I mean? You think, okay, how can I slice something up and show that you're breaking something down? And you're busy just having your lunch, and then you've got some cheese, and then before you know it, you're slicing the cheese up, and you think, oh, that works. It's a great analogy. And and you got to go write it down otherwise.
Yes, you're just in your everyday life, just being like, oh, there's a metaphor I can use. That's actually where one of the metaphors that I used in the book came from. I came up with an analogy around, I don't know if even, just take me back to English GCSE, where I'm like, what's a metaphor? What's a simile? Am I using the wrong one? An analogy, that's the word I was looking for. I came up with an analogy when I was driving my car, which is a hybrid car, that self-discipline and motivation are a little bit like the engines in a hybrid car, where like if you have motivation, i.e. fuel, you use it. But if there's no fuel in the tank, then this kind of backup battery, your self-discipline, has to kick in. And I remember driving this car and just feeling so proud of myself for coming up with that, being like, oh my God, I think I've done the thing that Hannah wants me to do. I think I've turned an idea into something that I can explain it with. And actually I've noticed when I explain it with that analogy, it just lands. so much more, because I guess we are just, though I don't know if it's even visual learners, I guess it's just like we are learners that need to like grab onto something a little bit more than just words.
It's tangible, so it's a vehicle to convey the message, and then also we're going to remember that analogy. So now I'm associating a car, say I might be in another hybrid car, and I might think about that same analogy. So the association is there, but you have this like aha moment, and you're like, yes, I know it. And that goes back to the whole idea of, you think that you need to sit down at your desk and come up with your best work, but actually the best artists or the best creatives aren't sat at their desks all the time. They're out just, you know, with their friends or on a walk with the dog or something. You're out there observing the world around you rather than closed off and in isolation.
Because I guess that is a big part of it, and probably the bigger part of it is actually having the ideas in the first place. I guess people's misconception would be that someone like yourself, your biggest amount of time and your biggest skill set is in the design, and although there's time spent there and you absolutely have a skill set there, like that would be useless if you didn't first have the skill set of observation and deep thinking. Have you always been that way? Like, do you kind of think that you're built quite well to do what you do? Are you always kind of thinking those deep thoughts?
Well, maybe I do like to think deep thoughts, but I've always been a creative. So I did fine art as a degree, and then I moved into graphic design, and this was how Quoted Visually happened. It was a kind of like a project between the two. I've always been interested in anything creative, so I've always been busying myself with something. When I was growing up, I was trying to be a teacher and making all these different workbooks for a class that I didn't have, but anything like sewing clothes for a teddy bear. And so I've always been keeping myself occupied with something. I'm never bored. Maybe that helps. Like this curiosity, self-improvement, and the interest in trying to push myself as far as I can. Because I've spoken about this before, but when I had my dyslexia assessment years ago, they told my mum that I wouldn't be able to read a book, or, they had these silly claims that I wouldn't be able to do certain things when I'm older. And so you grow up feeling a bit different, like, oh, I need special support. The things that make you feel different in school actually become your superpower when you're in the workplace, because you're like, okay, well, this is actually beneficial because I can see things like this. And so that way of looking is celebrated, and it's something that I've compensated for a lot. So I will always work really, really hard so that I can make sure that I get the grades, for example, in school. And then finally it translated into something useful.
Interesting. Do you think your past self would be like absolutely thrilled but a bit bemused that you've turned this into a job? Because I mean, it's amazing that this is what you do.
It's bizarre, isn't it? Yeah. I felt very like lacking in some sort of purpose. When Quoted Visually came along, it helped me develop this confidence in my own voice. I was under the radar. I was working for a small company, and as lovely as they were, I just felt like I had something to give. And when you feel like you're just behind the scenes and you think, actually, no, if I was to try and put myself out there, somebody might like what I've got to share. I don't know. And
what you said there of kind of trusting that you have something to give, I feel like that's such a key part in putting work out there. Like putting out various visuals or diagrams or messages. Yes, it's so much about the practical, but it's also about trusting that someone is going to resonate with it. Someone's going to want to take that in. Do you notice, and I guess this is me a bit more with my marketing brain on, I wonder if you notice that often the best performing content is sometimes the content where you think this is quite simple, or this is quite obvious, or kind of everyone knows this concept. Do you notice sometimes you can have a tendency to want to make it really different or bigger or better, and it's like, actually, sometimes you've just got to trust that message is what people want to hear?
Yeah, and often it might be something that you just weren't sure about and you put it out. There was this one where there was a swing, you can't have the highs without the lows. There was one that I did about trauma, which was, I'm now forgetting it, but it's not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. No, in fact, that's another one that I never made. But there's one about trauma, and I did it maybe in 2022, and it just has been my most viral post.
Wow.
And it just struck a chord.
Did you know when you posted it, like, this is going to strike a chord? Or was that one of those ones where you're just kind of like, yeah,
I was not sure whether I should post it. You don't know how something's going to be received. And it's just a case of keeping going. And I think one of the challenges is we've got to not let sharing our work get in the way of creating. And it can be quite heavy. There's lots involved when you start, okay, I've got to schedule some posts, or I've got to put this in front of people. And it's finding that, I say that you've got this connection between you and your craft, and it's like some sort of signal. In order to keep that connection strong, you want to keep creating little and often, and that keeps that bond between you, and it's a sensitivity, really, isn't it? And you feel in touch with that creative side. But if you let that go, you then lost in all the noise.
Is experimentation quite a big part of kind of how you grown and how you kind of continue to get better at what you're doing?
Yeah, because you never know really. You're just kind of going with experimentation in terms of like my illustrations. Actually, I haven't experimented that much. I just picked a style and ran with it.
Yeah.
And that was whatever font I picked that one day. I had a couple of days of annual leave and I just thought, right, it's going to happen or it's not going to happen. And so
I love that.
I published it. I think it must have been the end of December 2021. So there are some things that you just keep as a creative constraint.
Yeah.
And you not stop iterating, but little tweaks that you make along the way. But the growth does happen from just being, not afraid to put yourself out there.
And I guess testing out the different messages, the different ways of communicating things and kind of getting to know what works and what doesn't. There's definitely been things that I've shared in the past visually where the data tells me that did not work. And I have to, in that moment, after I've had my little pity party, go, actually, that was a positive because I've learned something.
Yes.
So now I know a way not to do it. So maybe next time I can try a different way. And I guess that's a big thing for us to kind of navigate, is leaving that perfectionism at the door, not expecting everything we do to work, but actually just looking to learn. Does it work? Does it not? Either way, we've gained something from that. Do you see with your students that can be something they need kind of helping with?
Well, the perfectionism is definitely something that you think you need to have everything sorted before you do your first post. And I try and create the space where people can share, whatever they've created and not feel like they're judging it. Because there's this whole thing where quality or quantity. For me, I try and go for quality on my social media, quantity in the behind the scenes. I create a lot, but I'm just careful with what I share. But quantity does lead to quality. But I've always been suggesting that, so I post, for example, 3 times a week or 2, depending on what my life's doing. But some people post daily. For me, that was just not something that I could ever do. And so I set that bar for myself. That's my personal boundary, if you like. But if you've worked on something and it's a stronger illustration, that's going to hit home with much more people than if you try and do more. And it's just diluting down your message or the strength in your message.
That's a really good way to look at it. I'd not thought about it in that way before. If it doesn't need to be quantity or quality, but you can do quantity of action to learn and then choose the quality that feels right to be putting out there. That's a really nice way to look at it. When you're finishing off an illustration, when you're looking at your iPad or your laptop and you're going like, okay, is this ready to go? Is there like a checklist in your head that you kind of work through to work out like, yes, this is good? Because obviously you can't get, until you post something, you don't know whether it resonates or not. But obviously then I'd imagine there's some kind of do's and don'ts that you always keep in mind. For people listening, maybe before they finish off that workshop slide or that social media graphic, is there anything for them to keep in mind to just make sure that it's as good as they can make it?
Yeah, there's quite a few things I would say. So just make sure that it makes sense on its own, because the whole point of using a visual is to make the information clearer. And if I'm more confused after looking at it, you need to tweak it so that it does make sense.
So if it requires the caption or you describing it to make sense, actually the goal should be that it makes sense without those things, and those things maybe complement it or add depth.
Unless you're having icons and it's some sort of visual aid. But if you're really trying to make the type of visual that I've been creating here, where it's a cohesive piece, it makes sense on its own. Key also is to make sure it's actionable. So if I've read that and I'm thinking, so what? So what? Like, you don't really want to be thinking, okay, my life is not better off having looked at this. Like, why did I even look at it, And so you want it wants to feel actionable. Have some sort of idea in mind that you want people to do or feel. Generally, mine is about empowerment and making people feel better about themselves. And so it's sort of like a little pick-me-up, if you like. So you could say the same topic but then make someone feel worse. It's just how you phrase it. So
true.
Just thinking about that.
Will you do any testing of a visual? Do you send it to people before you put it out into the world to kind of check that it is making sense to people? Is that something people can do?
Yeah, that's the best thing to do, because especially when you're starting out, you can have family group or something where I made, I think it was Hannah's focus group in WhatsApp. Some
they willingly added or just they were like, here I am,
forcefully added? No, there's only a couple people in there. But when I was starting out, it's just, can you tell me if there are any spelling mistakes here, or is there something I've missed? Because you need to gain that critical distance. And the fastest way to do that is to get somebody else who's not as close to it as you are. I have this background in fine art. So for me, if I was doing a painting, you don't just paint the painting when you're standing right next to the painting. you stand back and you look at it from a distance and you see what's working and what doesn't work. So it's simulating that. And then another thing is I have some friends that I've made who also like to make illustrations. So if you've got some creative friends and you can just send them the illustration, it's something to do with looking at what's working for them and helping each other. A lot of my growth and where I am today, it's not because of me, it's because of the people that I've been with on the journey. And so it's not seeing it as a solo pursuit and more of as a community-based activity, and you're chipping away at it together.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way to look at it, because also ultimately an illustration's impact is only really down to how well it's received, as in how clear it is, how much it makes an impact for people. We might think it's the best thing ever if we've created it. But I guess getting, like you said, that kind of critical distance, I've not heard that phrase before, but I really like it, is important in that process. Any other kind of do's and don'ts that you think about when you're going to finish off a piece?
Well, you've got to start trusting your own judgment as well. So that's the other thing. You could send it to various family members and they could really put you off. So it's just sort of like holding your own and saying, no, this is what I was trying to say here. And the do's and don'ts would kind of spatially, just making sure it's not too cluttered on the page. You also think about how you want the image to be read. So you can have a strong sense of visual hierarchy, which would be in the form of having a title and then some, body text. And you want people to be reading that title first, obviously, and then, how are they going to move their eyes through the piece? If you've got some text on the left and then you want them to, and other text on the right, but you want them to read the text on the right first, that's not really going to work because people read from left to right. So it's really thinking about, I've got visual on a visual, but it's like...
It's very annoying we're in a podcast format right now, Hannah. We really need, well, it's recorded as well if people are on YouTube, but...
Yeah, like imagine like a pancake stack or some kind of layer. Say you're kind of a cross section of a visual. The title will be sitting on top, topographic map, I think.
Yeah.
The title sits on top, like of the mountain, and then you've just got to think about how you're directing people through the image. And then maybe you've got your logo on it, but make sure your logo is not the first thing people see. So that's at the bottom, essentially, of the map, if you're thinking of it in terms of a height.
Yes, so much to think about.
Yeah.
Do you find when you're looking at other people's visuals, even if you don't realise it, you're like, oh, could have edited that, or like, oh, that's good because of that. Like you see things through such a different lens now.
Yeah, you can't unsee once you're looking.
Yeah.
But then also looking at other people's work, you think, oh, damn, I would love to have come up with that idea. That's another thing, being careful what we consume. When we are trying to create, it might be the best case to not consume other people's work, because then we actually aren't thinking for ourselves and we've got this idea in our mind of their work. Yeah, the trap of comparison, but also if we want to create something that's truly unique, we need to create that space.
Yes, and I actually have a very topical example of that. When I was finishing off my book and we'd confirmed all of the words, we were then in the design stage, which, oh my goodness, was so much bigger than writing it. It took so much time, but thankfully I was working with an amazing team where I would just kind of say things and then they would go and actually make it look good and do the things. And part of the reason why that was such a big part of the process for my book was because I didn't want it to be just 50,000 words in a row. I really wanted the inside to feel almost like a textbook where there's so many sections and visuals and diagrams and little mini post-it notes and lists and whatever else. And thankfully that's been really well received since it's come out. But when we were in the process of pulling together those visuals, I remember sending the team not your Instagram account, but a screenshot of one of your visuals. And then I said, I'm not telling you who this is because we're not going to go and look at her stuff because otherwise we're going to accidentally create it. And I don't think I've told you this, Hannah. For those 4 months, I had to mute your Instagram account because I didn't trust myself to not accidentally see something and go, oh, that's a great analogy. And then when I chat to my designer the next week, I go, oh, do you know the analogy that we should use is this? And so exactly that, I kind of took what you did as like, okay, here's the example. And then now let's leave the inspiration there and give ourselves space to kind of think from the ground up. Because that's always is my biggest fear, that I'll completely accidentally rip someone off. But that was what we had to do for the book, because I was like, that's exactly what you do. If I write another book, I would absolutely say to my publishers, hello, can we pay this amazing woman called Hannah that I know, because she's great, to do it for us. But exactly what you do is what I wanted in the book. I was like, I just want there to be visuals where, just as you said, people don't have to read any of the accompanying pages of text. They can just see it. And it hits home. So first of all, thank you for being that example. But yeah, second of all, I can attest to having to watch what you consume to make sure you're creating in the best way.
Yeah, well, huge. That's a huge compliment. Thank you. And
not at all.
Your book is incredible. I haven't had the chance to read everything, but it's that type of book that you can scan and just get nuggets of wisdom immediately, because it's really accessible with all of the images that you made the effort to put in, and especially the pictures, because I think that adds a necessary context for us to really engage with the content.
Yes, completely. And it's been amazing to have the feedback since from people, particularly those who are neurodiverse, saying that visual element has made it so much more accessible. When I wrote the book, it was kind of a preference, like, oh yeah, I'd like for it to be quite visual, and now I'm like, gosh, I'm so glad that happened, and that would now be a non-negotiable for me. And actually that was part of what sparked having you on the podcast, because I was like, wow, I've seen firsthand in my talks, in the book, in quite a few things recently, that when I make things visual, they make so much more sense. And so then I was like, surely I'm not the only business owner that's needing to do this. And I think actually it is simpler than you think. Let's talk about the tech, because I bet that's something that overwhelms people.
Yes.
I mean, I've hopefully soothed a few hearts by saying that I use the clip art available to me on Canva, which I'm sure is like the lowest of the low. What is your advice to people? Maybe, obviously they've got options out there like your Canva graphics, if they just want to take someone else's graphic and, well, not take someone else's, it's Canva's. I don't think that counts as ripping them off because it's available. But anyway,
you pay for some sort of license when you have used Canva.
Yeah, and I'm not selling those slides as well.
Yeah.
Definitely not sellable. They're so ugly. But for people who are like, I want to make them myself, but maybe they haven't got the software yet, like, what are the things you would recommend to people? Like, what do you need to get started?
Not much. I mean, if you really want to think about the idea itself, you could actually just take a photo of your drawings. There is a way to just draw it on. I mean, if you can got that in pen and pencil, that'd be absolutely fine. Some people do that. They take pictures of the paper.
Yeah. I bet that actually makes it more eye-catching as well, because it stands out against a lot of computer-made graphics that you see.
Yes, because it's not AI generated, is it?
Yes.
So, hey, there's lots of benefits to just going and sticking with just focus on the actual skill, and rather than trying to make it look pretty. Also, maybe even a whiteboard, because that's like quite fun. You see people doing social media posts where they hold up a whiteboard and there's some kind of like immediacy. You see that their handwriting, and it feels quite personal. But if you want to go and digitalize your sketches, the best software I'd say to use would be Figma. It's available and it's free. It has a paid plan, but you can get access a free plan. Just don't overthink it. See, I use Adobe Illustrator, and in my course it was a difficult thing because I want to make it accessible, but yet I use a paid for tool.
Yeah.
And so I decided to show both. But I don't use Figma, so I had to, in the videos, I was very much showing people, look, this is me, just like, I don't know how to use this. I'm just fumbling around, but I've managed to put this together. And you just grab, you think that you need to draw. That's another thing. Like, how do I even get started? Yeah. There's a pen tool where it's kind of like a drag and drop. So you can create a shape just by dragging and dropping. And you don't actually need, you can use a mouse. You don't need a graphics tablet. You just trace a shape, and that might be a picture of your drawing that you can scan in to trace something. Or you get a photo and then you trace around a light bulb. So you're not taking somebody's illustration and tracing it, but or you can, but you blend multiple different ones together.
Interesting. Because I guess that's the only thing to be conscious of. Like, when I'm on Canva, obviously using graphics provided by Canva that I pay for, because people want to be careful not to just like Google illustration of iceberg and then that's their illustration that they use, because actually that they will not have the licensing to use that visual, particularly not in a business context, which I think people don't clock. Just because you're not selling it, if you're profiting in any way off of a visual, whether that be just because it helps to build a brand or using it in a presentation, like, you need to have the rights to it. Yes. So is that something for people to be careful of?
I suppose, there's a lot of different angles. It depends whether you're the one creating it or
Let's talk about creating it first. If you're using, like, can you use other people's illustrations? Do you have people just, like, I don't know, screenshot the ice cream buckets from your thing and then put their own text underneath it? I'm guessing that is a no-no.
Yeah, I try not to let myself get too bogged down, because my other friends in the space, we've had periods where we just get really, really frustrated, and you end up spending too much time on somebody who's pretending that it's theirs. They don't, but sometimes you message somebody and they'll just delete it and they say so sorry, and that's cool. Yeah, you don't take somebody else's work, especially if it's a visual and it's in the same context. It's really obvious that that you've just gone ahead and done that. Or translating it, that's a challenging one. But or adding your own logo to somebody else's work, putting your picture of your face on it. You see everything.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know.
People are wild.
But they don't realise. I think that's a thing. And so it's unfortunately it's the job of the illustrator to be educating people about how best that other people can use your work. And everybody will have different preferences.
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, anybody can share my work for free. But then if you're going to use it in a business setting, then you might want to pay for a license for your book or your newsletter or something of that nature.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So I guess from the perspective of when you're creating visuals, using a platform that's free like Figma to kind of create something of your own, or making sure if you're using something like, say, something through Canva, you've got the licensing to use that. And then when you're posting, because I see your graphics on LinkedIn sometimes, and then sometimes they'll have credited you.
Yeah.
But there's probably 1 or 2 times where I've seen it and been like, oh, interesting. Like maybe Hannah's name is like, because I know you add your watermark, which I'm sure is something we can talk about, but people don't necessarily always credit. Is that something you come up against a lot? Have you, like, it must be exhausting to try and ask everyone to credit, but I guess it's important that they do because they're sharing your work.
Yeah, I think the challenging part is I don't have enough time in the day to go and be the police, the angry person that goes and tells people that they've stolen my work. I don't like who that makes me.
Yeah, that's not nice energy for you as well, is it?
No, I just and so it is part of it, and it's finding out what okay, if I see something and I'm just not happy with how it's been used, you can just send a gentle message. Sometimes you can't get hold of that person. But the where you want to chase it is if somebody's sharing your work and they're in the public space, they've got a lot of influence, and you know that if they are going to be crediting you correctly, then it's going to benefit lots of different artists. So it's not an isolated case.
Yeah.
And that job of serving the community of creatives is something that you're not just doing it for yourself, you're just making sure that other people's work's not going to be abused, essentially.
And I know you add your logo or name to all of your work. Is that something you'd recommend everyone does if they're kind of sharing visual creations online or in any setting?
I don't use the copyright symbol, but it's best to assert your copyright. Okay. And so that gives that sense that there's somebody behind the illustration. Also, just in the comment, you could also say that you own the copyrights. So it's really just making it perfectly clear that there's a person there. I mean, I originally didn't start putting watermarks on. There was this idea that if you don't have a watermark, someone would make the effort to link back to that person's profile. But I think that that's very idealistic in hindsight.
It's amazing, isn't it? I think people really do fall into one of two camps, because I'm definitely in the camp of like, I'm terrified of not crediting someone, and I will almost probably end up not sharing something if I've got a photo of me and I don't know who's taken it, I just won't share it, because the thought of creatives not being linked back to their work just doesn't sit right with me. But then I would make that same assumption as you, like, oh yeah, everyone's going to go to that effort. Whereas, there's definitely people out there that are just, and I guess they're not often thinking maliciously. They're just thinking, that's cool, I'll share that. And maybe not everyone's educated on. But
it's somebody's livelihood. And
completely.
Essentially, unfortunately, their education isn't there. And I think I always say is that if you don't know who's created the image and you really, really want to share it, just state that you don't know and state that you're looking. Then it's one thing sharing it with saying unknown source, and then another thing just sharing it without that, because it essentially looks like to anybody else that you've made it. And that's like really vastly different. And I think that you can always edit the credits, but you can't kind of take back if someone thinks that you owned it.
Interesting. Okay. And just my final question on this, if someone's listening to this and then they come to your account and they're like, oh my gosh, that visual is genius, and I'd love to use that visual on my social media to link with the work that I do as a business, or that would work really well on that slide, can they do that? And if they do that, is it just about making sure that credit is there? I'm sure every artist might be a little bit different, but what's your take on people doing that? Because I guess that's another potential approach, is if you really, really don't have the ability to make your own visuals, is there a way of incorporating other people's to share your message?
Yeah, like or you can license other people's work. But yeah, you can do that as long as there's, appropriate credits. But if it's some sort of for a slide, a presentation, then that's more of a business setting, and you might want to pay for a license for that.
Sure.
Yeah, you honestly, it's the only thing that you get people that might every week they share the same, carousel of my work, and they maybe have 1 million followers, and it's just a constant pumping out of just like content. Wow. It's very different, like sharing your work as part of of your strategy occasionally, rather than making it your strategy to share someone else's work. If you see the difference. Yeah,
makes total sense. It's like your Lad Bibles or your Barstool Sports, where like all of their content is just stolen off of other people.
Oh yeah.
And you see viral videos go, you know, out on TikTok, and Lad Bible comments, "Hey, we love this, can we use it?" And these poor unsuspecting people just go, "Yeah, sure." And I'm just screaming back at them from my phone, like, don't let them have it, or if they have it, they should pay you. Like, I think, yeah, so many people are unaware of kind of how that system can work. But that's a good way to look at it, of like, yeah, if it's kind of maybe part of what you're sharing versus like, yeah, if someone's whole account is just like quoted visually graphics for a business use, maybe not quite the same.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a message recently. Someone said, "Can I share your work every week?" And it's the same thing. It's just like, well, I mean,
you're like, if you have to ask, it probably means you know that you probably shouldn't. So I'm going to leave you to reflect on that.
Yeah.
Anna, this has been so interesting for me, like genuinely really inspiring, and really made me want to go and create some content that is more visual. You know, we all know, don't we, everyone's saying, oh, create more video content, and like video content's great, but like I just think sometimes nothing beats a good old visual where you can, as you said, just look at it for a few seconds and just be like, got it, got the message, got the one thing, ready to go. And as I've shared a bit, you know, the last few months I've really seen the value of finding visual ways to describe a concept, and I feel like a total beginner at it, but actually just seeing the impact of doing that in my talks and in my book, I'm like, oh gosh, if I really put a bit of work into this, maybe this could actually become quite effective. So I'm feeling really inspired, and I know for the listeners it will be the same. Is there any kind of final encouragement maybe that you'd like to leave people with, if they are listening to this and thinking, oh, okay, my brain's whirring, I think I could have a go at turning some of my ideas or messages into visuals? What would be your parting wisdom for them? You've shared so much already, so no pressure.
You. We all have valuable ideas to share, and so sometimes we need a bit of help communicating those ideas, but it's just to trust your gut. And if there's something, you know, that you think, oh, I need to get this out there into the world, do it, because, you know, if it's benefiting you, you know, it's going to benefit somebody else. And it's just trusting that intuition that you have and not feeling like you need permission from somebody else to post. You'll build up that confidence as you go. And so if you start making these visual ideas, don't be put off by feeling like you're not good enough, because the skill comes over time. And so, as I said before, even I need to practice. I need to keep going at it. You know, through building this really, really crazy platform of mine, I didn't expect my Instagram grew to 100,000 in 8 months. And I'm not, the thing is I'm not special. I literally just did something and then kept doing it. And so the encouraging thing is if you're really committed enough and just keep doing it, you will start to see the reward. But if you stay in your head and then you think, oh, it's not good enough to share, you're not going to develop that skill or get the message out.
Oh, I love that. And I think that is the perfect note to end on. And I will say, I know what you mean when you say, oh, I'm not special. But the fact that you did the thing and kept doing the thing, I think that's the biggest thing that makes you special. Because that's so often where people get stuck, isn't it? They have the idea and they think, oh, I'm not special, so I can't do it. But actually, all of the people I know, yourself included, who have built really successful things, didn't have anything magical. They just kept going. And so that's a really great reminder for people. And I mean, I feel like there's a whole nother episode here of like, how does it feel to have grown 100,000 people looking at your work in 8 months? That must have been a whole journey, but we'll have you back for part 2.
Oh, of course, there's plenty. I'm not in social media, but I accidentally, you know, became somebody who runs a page that's quite big. And there was a time, as you were saying that just there, that I realised that, hey, the only way to win now is just to keep going. And there are people that fell off and didn't keep going with the visual ideas, and maybe that they needed to stop for, they had other reasons, they had other things to prioritize. But from my perspective, I realized that it's literally just keep putting one foot in front of the other. These creative processes, struggle is part of creativity. And so if you're struggling and you're just in that stage where you're working through the problem. And so that's not a signal or a sign to give up. It's a sign to keep going, because you're just in the nitty gritty of that process.
What a way to end this episode. I know that I needed to hear that. So thank you so much. I will, of course, leave all of your links in the show notes. People can come and check out your work, and they can also look at your course, which I have had a privileged sneak peek of, and I can say is just packed with so much of what we touched on today, but obviously in so much more depth, you know, all of the examples and how-tos, as you said. So I'll leave that linked below for people to check out if they're interested in learning more about how to do this in a more kind of formal way. So just thank you for everything that you've shared. And from what you've just said, it doesn't sound like you're stopping anytime soon, but from my side, please keep going because your work is very needed. And yeah, just feel really inspired by what you do. So thank you.
Oh, that means a huge amount. I would say that I'm trying to find a way to make this long term. So I'm trying to find a way to, how can I keep going? And so that's finding sometimes freelance can be quite intense. So I'm looking at different ways to keep this going and be part of this creative outlet. And so it's more than just making it into a business. It's this creative outlet and self-expression, which is really important to me.
Amazing to see that journey.
But thank you very much for having me. It's been a privilege.
Thanks for being here.